Thomas Hartwell was ready to send his mail-order bride back to Boston the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, until Mrs. Patterson whispered her full name and 15 years of buried guilt came crashing down around him. Could the widow of the man he'd failed to save at Gettysburg be the key to his redemption, or would confronting his past destroy them both? Thunder crashed across the Wyoming hills like God's own hammer striking iron. Thomas Hartwell jerked awake in his wooden chair, the half-empty whiskey bottle sliding off his lap and hitting the floor with a sharp crack. Lightning lit up his small cabin, showing off the mess he'd been living in for weeks, dirty plates stacked like a crooked tower, clothes thrown everywhere, and dust covering everything like a gray blanket. The sound that woke him wasn't thunder after all. Someone was pounding on his front door hard enough to shake the whole building. Thomas stumbled to his feet, his head spinning from too much drinking and not enough sleeping. Outside, the autumn storm of 1867 was throwing everything it had at the Wyoming Territory, and whatever fool was out there in this weather must have something mighty important to say. "Thomas Hartwell, you open this door right now." The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the town's busiest busybody and the woman who seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "I've got news that can't wait." Thomas dragged himself across the room, his boots crunching on broken glass from the bottle. His hands shook as he lifted the heavy wooden bar that kept his door locked. When he pulled it open, the wind nearly knocked him backward, and Mrs. Patterson rushed inside like a chicken running from a fox. Water dripped from her black coat onto his floor, and her gray hair had escaped from under her hat, making her look like she'd been wrestling with the storm itself. But her eyes were bright with excitement, the way they always got when she had gossip to share. "You look terrible," she said, looking around his messy cabin with disapproval. "When's the last time you ate a real meal, or took a bath, or cleaned this place?" Thomas ran a hand through his unwashed hair and tried to focus on her words. The whiskey was still making his thoughts fuzzy, like trying to see through muddy water. "What do you want, Mrs. Patterson? It's the middle of the night. It's 3 in the afternoon, you fool." She shook her head and pulled a yellow paper from inside her coat. "This came for you on the morning stage. It's about that mail-order bride arrangement we talked about last month." The words hit Thomas like a bucket of cold water. He'd almost forgotten about the letters he'd been writing to some woman back east, the ones Mrs. Patterson had insisted would solve his loneliness problem. After weeks of whiskey and self-pity, the whole thing seemed like something that had happened to someone else. "I told you I changed my mind about that," Thomas said, backing away from her like she was holding a rattlesnake. "Send word that the deal is off. I don't need a wife." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared under her hat. "Don't need a wife? Thomas Hartwell, you're living like a wild animal in here. You haven't been to town in 2 weeks, you missed Sunday service again, and old Pete told me you haven't been taking care of your cattle properly." She was right, and Thomas knew it. Ever since the nightmares had gotten worse, ever since the memories of the war had started eating at him like hungry wolves, he'd been letting everything fall apart. His ranch, his appearance, his whole life, it was all sliding downhill faster than a rock rolling off a cliff. "The woman's name is Catherine Morrison," Mrs. Patterson continued, unfolding the telegram with careful fingers. "She's from Boston, educated, and she's already on her way here. The stage will arrive tomorrow at noon." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Tomorrow? How had time moved so fast without him noticing? He looked around his cabin, seeing it through the eyes of a proper Boston lady. The filth, the broken furniture, the smell of whiskey and despair that hung in the air like smoke. "Send her back," he said quickly. "Tell her I'm sick, or dead, or that the whole thing was a mistake. I'm not ready for this." Mrs. Patterson studied his face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been reading people's secrets for 60 years. Something in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she folded the telegram and put it back in her coat. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Something about this Catherine Morrison that you might want to know before you make any final decisions." The way she said it made Thomas's stomach clench with worry. Mrs. Patterson had a gift for knowing things that could change a person's whole world, and right now she was looking at him like she held his future in her hands. "What kind of something?" Thomas asked, even though part of him didn't want to know. The old woman smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. It was the kind of smile that came before bad news, the kind that said everything was about to change whether you wanted it to or not. "Sit down, Thomas," she said gently. "What I'm about to tell you is going to knock you flat on your back." Mrs. Patterson settled herself in Thomas's least dirty chair and smoothed her wet skirts with hands that trembled just slightly. The storm outside had quieted to a steady drumming of rain on the roof, but inside the cabin, the air felt heavy with secrets waiting to be told. Thomas remained standing, swaying a little from the whiskey still in his system. His mind was starting to clear, the way it always did when danger was coming. Something in Mrs. Patterson's manner reminded him of the moments before battle, when the air got still and every soldier knew that everything was about to change forever. "Catherine Morrison isn't just any woman looking for a husband," Mrs. Patterson began, pulling out a second letter from her coat. This one was older, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded many times. "She wrote to me personally after seeing your advertisement in the Boston newspaper." Thomas frowned. He'd placed that advertisement months ago, back when the loneliness had been eating at him so badly that even the company of his cattle hadn't been enough. It was a simple thing, rancher in Wyoming Territory seeking wife for companionship and help with household duties. Nothing fancy, nothing that should have caught the attention of anyone special. "So," Thomas said, though his heart was starting to beat faster for reasons he couldn't explain. "So she didn't just answer your advertisement by accident," Mrs. Patterson said, unfolding the letter with careful fingers. "She was looking for you specifically, Thomas. She's been searching for you for 3 years." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His knees went weak, and he had to grab the back of a chair to keep from falling. 3 years ago was 1864, the worst year of his life, the year when everything had gone wrong and he'd lost the only person who'd ever meant anything to him. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered, but even as he said it, cold fear was crawling up his spine like ice water. Mrs. Patterson held up the letter so he could see the careful handwriting on the outside. "Her full name, Thomas, is Catherine Morrison Blackwood. She was married before, to a cavalry officer who died in the war. She's been a widow for 3 years, and she's been looking for someone ever since." The name hit Thomas like lightning striking a tree. Blackwood. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years, but it lived in his nightmares every single night. Captain James Blackwood, the best friend Thomas had ever had. The man who'd saved his life and died because Thomas had been too proud and too stupid to listen to good advice. Thomas stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. The cabin seemed to be spinning around him, and for a moment he thought he might pass out right there on his own floor. "You knew him," Mrs. Patterson said, and it wasn't a question. Her voice was gentle now, the way people talked around fresh graves. "You knew Captain James Blackwood." Thomas closed his eyes, but that only made the memories stronger. James laughing around a campfire, sharing his rations when supplies ran low. James writing letters to his sweetheart back home, reading parts of them aloud because he was so proud of her. James taking a Confederate bullet that should have killed Thomas, dying in Thomas's arms while asking him to deliver a message to the woman he loved. "He saved my life," Thomas said, the words coming out like broken glass. "And I got him killed." Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her joints creaking with age and damp weather. She walked over to where Thomas was leaning against the wall and placed one wrinkled hand on his arm. "She knows who you are, Thomas," she said softly. "James wrote about you in his letters home. He told her you were the best man he'd ever known, that you'd saved his life during the cholera outbreak at Fort Sumner. She's been trying to find you ever since the army told her he was dead." Thomas shook his head violently, trying to shake away the words that were cutting into him like knife blades. "No, she can't know. If she knew what really happened, if she knew that I was the reason James died, she'd what?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Hate you? Blame you?" "Thomas, this woman has been searching for 3 years just to meet you. That doesn't sound like hate to me." Outside, the storm was picking up again, wind howling around the corners of the cabin like lost souls. Thomas felt like one of those souls himself, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead, unable to find peace in either place. "I can't face her," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't look into the eyes of James's wife and pretend to be the man he thought I was. Not when I know the truth about what kind of man I really am." Mrs. Patterson squeezed his arm with surprising strength. "Maybe that's exactly what you need to do," she said. "Maybe facing her is the only way you'll ever find peace with what happened." The yellow telegram crackled in her other hand as she held it out to him. "She'll be here tomorrow, Thomas. The question is, are you going to meet her as the coward you think you are, or as the man James Blackwood believed you could be?" Thomas stared at the telegram, knowing that taking it would change everything, that once he read Catherine's words, there would be no going back to his safe, miserable isolation. But something in Mrs. Patterson's eyes told him that maybe, just maybe, going back wasn't what he needed anyway. Maybe what he needed was to finally move forward. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, followed by Thomas's angry curse echoing across the empty Wyoming hills. He stood in his backyard, a smoking pistol in his shaking hand, staring at the tin cans that remained perfectly untouched on the fence post 20 feet away. His aim, once deadly accurate during his cavalry days, had become as unreliable as everything else in his broken-down life. The sun was climbing higher, which meant Catherine Morrison Blackwood would arrive in Dusty Creek in less than 4 hours. Thomas had spent the whole night cleaning his cabin like a madman, scrubbing away months of neglect and self-pity. His hands were raw from washing dishes and his back ached from moving furniture, but the physical pain felt good compared to the terror gnawing at his insides. He reloaded the pistol with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The simple task that he'd once done blindfolded during midnight raids now took him 3 tries. Everything about him had gotten soft and useless during these years of hiding from the world, of drowning his memories in whiskey and isolation. "Maybe if I can't even hit a tin can, I don't deserve to face her," Thomas muttered, raising the gun again. This time his shot went wide by even more, disappearing harmlessly into the sagebrush. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him spin around, the pistol still in his hand. A rider was coming up the long dirt path to his ranch, moving fast enough to kick up a cloud of dust that sparkled in the morning light. As the figure got closer, Thomas recognized the sturdy frame of Doc Henderson, the town's physician and one of the few people who still bothered to check on Thomas's welfare. "Put that gun away before you shoot yourself by accident," Doc Henderson called out as he reined in his horse near Thomas's porch. The older man's face was flushed with excitement, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "I've got news from town that you need to hear right now." Thomas holstered his pistol and walked over to where Doc was dismounting. The physician was breathing hard, whether from the ride or from whatever news he carried. Thomas couldn't tell. "What's so important it couldn't wait?" Thomas asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. In his experience, urgent news was usually bad news. Doc Henderson pulled a folded newspaper from his saddlebag and thrust it toward Thomas. "This came in on the morning stage with the mail. It's a Boston paper about a week old. Look at page 3. Thomas unfolded the newspaper with hands that had started shaking again. The paper was crisp and clean, so different from the rough local sheets they got in Wyoming. The headlines spoke of politics and business matters that seemed as foreign to him as life on another planet. But when he found page 3, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. There, in black ink that seemed to burn itself into his eyes, was a small notice in the social section. "Mrs. Catherine Morrison Blackwood, widow of the late Captain James Blackwood, has departed Boston for the Western Territories to begin a new life. Mrs. Blackwood's friends wish her well in her brave adventure." But it wasn't the notice itself that made Thomas's world tilt sideways. It was the small photograph printed beside it, a formal portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the same face that had stared back at him from the daguerreotype he'd kept hidden in James's personal effects for 3 years. "She's beautiful," Doc Henderson said softly. "And according to Mrs. Patterson, she'll be your wife by Sunday if you don't mess this up." Thomas crumpled the newspaper in his fists, his mind reeling. All this time, he'd been carrying James's personal belongings like sacred relics, including that photograph of his beloved Catherine. He'd stared at that picture countless times during the dark nights when the guilt wouldn't let him sleep, wondering what kind of woman could inspire such devotion in a man like James Blackwood. "I can't do this," Thomas said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Doc, you don't understand. This woman loved James with her whole heart. How can I look her in the eye knowing that I'm the reason he's dead?" Doc Henderson studied Thomas's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for examining patients. After 30 years of practicing medicine on the frontier, he'd learned to read people as well as he read symptoms. "Thomas," Doc said slowly, "what exactly happened the day James died? You've never told anyone the whole story." The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He turned away from Doc's searching gaze, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. Out there, somewhere beyond those rolling hills, was the place where his life had changed forever, where his best friend had paid the price for Thomas's mistakes. "We were tracking Confederate raiders," Thomas began, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "A small group that had been hitting supply wagons near the Colorado border. James wanted to wait for reinforcements, but I convinced him we could handle it ourselves. I was so sure, so cocky." His voice trailed off as the memories came flooding back. The sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, James falling from his horse with blood spreading across his blue uniform. The way James had looked at him with forgiveness instead of blame, even as life drained out of him. "The raiders were better armed than we expected," Thomas continued. "Better trained, too. We walked right into an ambush, and James took a bullet that was meant for me. He lived long enough to ask me to find Catherine, to tell her he loved her and that he was sorry he couldn't keep his promises." Doc Henderson was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Thomas's confession. A hawk circled overhead, crying its lonely call across the empty landscape. "And instead of finding her, you came out here to hide," Doc said finally. Thomas nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Thomas Hartwell," Doc said, his tone gentle but firm, "you are the biggest fool I've ever doctored, and I've treated some real prize specimens over the years." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of a distant train whistle drifted across the prairie, carried on the morning wind. The noon stage would connect with that train in Dusty Creek, bringing Catherine Morrison Blackwood into his life whether he was ready or not. The Dusty Creek stagecoach station buzzed with more excitement than it had seen since the territorial governor's visit last spring. Catherine Morrison Blackwood stepped down from the dusty coach with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Her dark blue traveling dress somehow still neat despite the long journey from Boston. Her auburn hair was pinned up beneath a small hat, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from surviving great loss without becoming bitter. Thomas watched from across the street, hidden in the shadows of Henderson's general store, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in town could hear it. Even from this distance, he could see that the newspaper photograph hadn't done her justice. Catherine was more beautiful than any picture could capture, but it was something beyond her physical appearance that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. She moved through the world with the same gentle confidence that James had described in his letters, the same quiet strength that had made a cavalry captain fall in love with her from 3,000 miles away. "She's lovely," whispered Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, who had positioned herself near the store's window for the best view. "Mrs. Patterson says she can read Latin and French, and that she taught music lessons back in Boston." Thomas felt a stab of panic. An educated woman like that would take one look at his rough hands and simple ways and realize she'd made a terrible mistake. What could a former soldier turned cattle rancher possibly offer someone who'd lived in the cultured world of Boston society? Mrs. Patterson bustled across the dusty street like a general taking command of a battlefield. She enveloped Catherine in a welcoming embrace, chattering excitedly about the weather and the journey, while several other town ladies gathered around to introduce themselves. Catherine smiled and nodded at each introduction, but Thomas noticed how her eyes kept searching the crowd, as if looking for someone specific. Looking for him. "You planning to hide behind that flour barrel all day?" Doc Henderson's voice made Thomas jump. The physician had entered the store quietly, carrying his medical bag and wearing the amused expression he got when watching people make fools of themselves. "I'm not hiding," Thomas protested, though he immediately realized how ridiculous that sounded, since he was literally crouched behind a display of grain sacks. "Course not," Doc said dryly. "You're just conducting a detailed inspection of our floorboards from this particular angle." Through the window, Thomas could see Mrs. Patterson leading Catherine toward the hotel, the other ladies following like a parade of chattering birds. Catherine paused at the hotel steps and turned to look directly at the general store, her gaze seeming to pierce right through the glass to where Thomas was concealed. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Thomas felt something electric pass between them. Recognition, maybe, or simple curiosity. Catherine tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place him, then smiled a small, uncertain expression that somehow managed to be both hopeful and sad at the same time. "She knows it's you," Doc Henderson observed. "Mrs. Patterson probably described you down to the color of your eyes." Thomas stood up slowly, his legs stiff from crouching. His mouth felt dry as desert sand, and his palms were sweating despite the cool autumn air. "What am I supposed to say to her, Doc?" "Hello. I'm the man who got your husband killed. Pleased to meet you." Doc Henderson set down his medical bag and fixed Thomas with the stern look he usually reserved for patients who refused to take their medicine. "You're going to march over there and introduce yourself like a gentleman. Then you're going to listen to what she has to say before you start assuming you know how she feels." "But dash." "No buts," Doc interrupted. "That woman didn't travel 2,000 miles just to turn around and go home. She came here for a reason, and I suspect it has more to do with moving forward than dwelling on the past." The hotel door closed behind Catherine and her escorts, cutting off Thomas's view. He felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, as if he'd been granted a temporary reprieve from an execution. "I need a drink," Thomas muttered, turning toward the door. "What you need is a bath, a shave, and some clean clothes," Doc Henderson said firmly. "Mrs. Patterson has arranged for you to have dinner with Catherine tonight at the hotel. 7 o'clock sharp." Thomas felt his knees go weak. "Tonight? Already? I thought I'd have more time to." "To what? Work yourself into an even bigger panic." Doc shook his head. "Thomas, that woman has been waiting 3 years to meet you. Don't you think she's waited long enough?" Before Thomas could argue further, the store door opened with a sharp jingle of bells. A young boy rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and the importance of his message. "Mr. Henderson." "Doc Henderson," the boy gasped. "Mrs. Patterson sent me to find you. The new lady, the one from Boston. She's asking for someone named Lieutenant Hartwell. She says she has something that belongs to him." Thomas and Doc Henderson exchanged glances. The boy, young Tommy Fletcher from the livery stable, was practically bouncing on his toes with curiosity. "What kind of something?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy dug into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. "She said to give you this, and to tell you that Captain Blackwood wanted you to have it." Thomas took the bundle with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it. The wrapping was simple brown paper tied with string, but underneath he could feel the shape of something small and metallic. His heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully untied the string and folded back the paper. Inside was a pocket watch, James's pocket watch, the one he'd carried through every battle of the war. Thomas had seen it countless times, had watched James check it before making important decisions, had heard him wind it every night before sleep. Engraved on the back, in James's own careful handwriting, were the words, "For Thomas, the best friend a man could ask for." The world seemed to stop spinning. Thomas stared at the watch, remembering the last time he'd seen it, hanging from James's uniform as he lay dying in Thomas's arms, its steady ticking marking the final moments of a good man's life. "She kept it all this time," Thomas whispered. "She's been carrying it for 3 years, waiting to give it to me." Doc Henderson clapped a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Seems to me like she's been carrying more than just a watch, son. Maybe it's time you helped her set down some of that burden." Catherine Morrison Blackwood's hands trembled as she poured tea from the hotel's finest china set, the delicate cup rattling against the saucer like nervous laughter. Across the small table in the hotel's dining room, Thomas Hartwell sat rigid as a fence post, his freshly shaved face pale beneath his newly combed hair. The silence between them stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at any moment. "You look exactly like James described you," Catherine said softly, her Boston accent making the words sound musical compared to the rough frontier speech Thomas was used to. "He said you had honest eyes and hands that told stories." Thomas glanced down at his calloused palms, hands that had held his dying friend while blood soaked through blue cavalry wool. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to tell you something about the day James died. Something you might not want to hear." "Catherine," she corrected gently, "and I already know more than you think I do." The dining room around them hummed with the quiet conversations of other guests, but Thomas felt like they were alone in a bubble of tension. Through the window, he could see the last rays of sunlight painting the mountains gold, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song. Catherine reached into her small purse and pulled out a worn envelope, its edges soft from countless readings. "This is the last letter James wrote before the battle where he died. He mailed it the morning of the raid, and it reached me 3 weeks after the telegram telling me he was gone." Thomas's throat felt like it was closing up. "Catherine, you don't understand. I convinced him to go on that raid. If I hadn't been so stubborn, so sure we could handle those raiders ourselves He wrote about that decision," Catherine interrupted, unfolding the letter with careful fingers. "He said you were worried about the supply wagons getting hit again, about innocent people getting hurt while you waited for reinforcements that might not come in time." She began to read in a voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest Catherine, Thomas is blaming himself for our choice to pursue the raiders, but he doesn't see what I see. He doesn't understand that sometimes a man has to choose between what's safe and what's right. We chose right, and whatever happens, I'm proud to ride beside the finest man I've ever known." Thomas felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "But he died because of that choice. Because I pushed him to dash. He died because Confederate raiders shot him," Catherine said firmly, folding the letter and placing it on the table between them. "He died doing his duty, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Just like he would have chosen to do every time." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Thomas found himself staring at Catherine's face, seeing strength there that he hadn't expected. This wasn't the fragile widow he'd imagined, broken by grief and loss. This was a woman who had faced the worst thing that could happen and somehow found a way to keep living. "There's more," Catherine continued, pulling out a second piece of paper. "James wrote instructions for me, things he wanted me to do if he didn't come home. One of them was to find you." Thomas's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Find me for what? To blame me? To make me pay for what happened?" Catherine's laugh was soft but not happy. "To thank you, you foolish man. To thank you for being the kind of friend who would carry James's guilt along with your own. To thank you for caring so much about his death that you've been punishing yourself for 3 years." She leaned forward, her brown eyes intense in the lamplight. "James wrote that if anything happened to him, I should find Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell and tell him that some burdens are too heavy for one person to carry alone. He said you'd try to take responsibility for the whole war if someone didn't stop you." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hotel windows and sending autumn leaves skittering across the street like lost memories. Thomas felt something inside his chest beginning to crack, like ice breaking up in spring. "I should have saved him," Thomas whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his soul. "I should have been faster, smarter, better. I should have been the one who died." Catherine reached across the table and covered his clenched fist with her small hand. Her touch was warm and surprisingly strong, and Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "James would hate hearing you say that," she said quietly. "He saved your life during that cholera outbreak because he thought you were worth saving. Are you going to make his sacrifice meaningless by throwing away the life he died to protect?" The question hit Thomas like a slap across the face. He looked up into Catherine's eyes and saw something there that he hadn't expected, not blame or hatred, but understanding. And maybe, Just maybe the beginning of something that looked like forgiveness. But before he could respond, the dining room door burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Young Tommy Fletcher rushed in, his face red with excitement and fear. "Mr. Hartwell," the boy gasped. "Doc Henderson sent me to find you. There's been an accident at the Fletcher ranch. A bad one. He needs you to come right away." Thomas was on his feet before the boy finished speaking, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Whatever was happening between him and Catherine would have to wait. In a place like Dusty Creek, when someone needed help, you dropped everything and went. "What kind of accident?" Thomas asked, already reaching for his hat. "Pa was trying to break that new stallion, the one he bought from the army," Tommy said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "The horse threw him into the fence post, and now he won't wake up. Ma's crying something awful, and Doc says he might not make it through the night." Catherine stood up as well, her practical nature taking over. "Is there anything I can do to help? I have some nursing experience from the war hospitals back east." Thomas paused in the doorway, struck by her immediate offer to help strangers she'd never met. It was exactly the kind of thing James would have done, putting other people's needs ahead of his own comfort. "Come if you want," Thomas said, already moving toward the door. "But it won't be pretty, and it might be a long night." Catherine was already wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. James always said that's when people need help the most, during the long, ugly nights when everything seems hopeless. As they hurried out into the Wyoming darkness, Thomas found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, James had been right about more things than just duty and honor. Maybe he'd been right about the kind of woman Catherine was, and maybe he'd been right about the kind of man Thomas could become if he stopped running from his past long enough to face his future. Blood soaked through the bandages faster than Catherine could replace them, turning the Fletcher family's kitchen into something that looked more like a battlefield than a home. Pete Fletcher lay unconscious on the wooden table, his breathing shallow and irregular, while his wife Martha sobbed quietly in the corner. Their 3 young children huddled around her like frightened rabbits. "The bleeding won't stop," Doc Henderson muttered, his usually steady hands shaking as he worked. "That fence post opened up his skull worse than I thought. He needs surgery, real surgery, and I don't have the tools or the skill for something this serious." Thomas held the oil lamp higher, casting flickering shadows across Pete's pale face. In the yellowish light, the injured man looked already dead, and Thomas felt the familiar cold grip of helplessness settling around his heart. This was too much like those terrible nights during the war, when good men died because there wasn't enough medicine or skill or luck to save them. "The nearest real doctor is in Cheyenne," Martha Fletcher said between sobs. "That's 3 days' ride, and Pete won't last 3 hours at this rate." Catherine moved around the table like she'd been born to it, her hands sure and gentle as she cleaned blood from Pete's forehead. Her traveling dress was already stained red, but she didn't seem to notice or care. "During the war, I worked in a hospital in Boston," she said, her voice calm despite the crisis. "We saw head injuries like this from artillery shells. There's a procedure, it's dangerous, but it might give him a chance." Doc Henderson looked up sharply. "What kind of procedure?" Catherine's hands never stopped moving as she spoke. "The skull is pressing on his brain where it's cracked. If we can relieve that pressure, the bleeding might stop and he might wake up. But it means cutting into his head, and if we make a mistake, he'll die," Doc finished quietly. "He'll die anyway if we don't try," Catherine replied. "I've seen this operation done and I've assisted with it. It's not pretty, but it works when it's done right." Thomas stared at her in amazement. This gentle woman from Boston was talking about brain surgery like it was no more complicated than mending a torn shirt. Her hands moved with confidence as she examined Pete's wound, and for the first time since the accident, Thomas felt a small flicker of hope. "What do you need?" Thomas asked. Catherine looked around the kitchen, her mind working quickly. "Clean water, lots of it. Sharp knives, the sharpest you have. Needle and thread for stitching. And something for Pete to bite on when he wakes up, because this is going to hurt." Martha Fletcher stood up, wiping her tears on her apron. "I'll get whatever you need. Just tell me Pete's going to be all right." "I can't promise that," Catherine said honestly. "But I can promise we'll do everything possible to save him." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Catherine worked with the focused intensity of a general commanding troops, her Boston accent becoming more pronounced as she gave orders. Thomas found himself following her instructions without question, holding tools and adjusting the lamp while she did things that seemed impossible for someone who wasn't a trained doctor. "There," Catherine said finally, stepping back from the table with blood up to her elbows. "The pressure is relieved, and the bleeding has stopped. Now we wait to see if he wakes up." Pete Fletcher's breathing was stronger now, more regular, and some color had returned to his face. His wife sat beside him holding his hand, whispering prayers and promises into his ear. Thomas and Catherine stepped outside into the cool night air, both of them exhausted and covered in blood. The stars seemed impossibly bright after the close, tense atmosphere of the kitchen, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called its haunting song across the prairie. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas asked, his voice full of wonder. Catherine sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly looking very young and very tired. "My brother was a surgeon in the Union Army. When I couldn't stand waiting at home anymore, not knowing if James was alive or dead, I volunteered at the hospital where my brother worked. I saw terrible things, Thomas. Things that would give you nightmares for years." She looked up at the stars, and Thomas could see tears shining on her cheeks. "But I also saw people survive things that should have killed them, just because someone was willing to try something dangerous instead of giving up. Sometimes that's all the difference between life and death. Someone who refuses to quit." Thomas sat down beside her on the step, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body. "Is that why you came here? Because you refused to quit on something?" Catherine turned to look at him, and in the starlight her face was serious and beautiful and sad all at once. "I came because James asked me to. In that last letter, he didn't just ask me to find you and thank you. He asked me to help you forgive yourself, because he said you were too stubborn to do it alone." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "He asked you to help me?" "He said you'd blame yourself for his death, and that you'd probably spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for things that weren't your fault. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I'd do whatever it took to make you understand that his death had meaning because you lived." Thomas felt something breaking apart inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart during 3 years of guilt and self-hatred. "Catherine, I don't deserve dash." "Stop," she said firmly, placing her hand over his. "Just stop. You don't get to decide what you deserve, Thomas Hartwell. You don't get to make James's sacrifice worthless by throwing away everything he died to protect." Inside the house, they could hear Pete Fletcher stirring, his voice weak but alive as he asked for water. Martha's cry of joy carried through the night air like music, and Thomas realized that sometimes the most important victories were the small ones. Saving one life, helping one family, refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless. "What happens now?" Thomas asked quietly. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. "Now we go inside and make sure Pete Fletcher gets through the night. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." As they stood up to go back inside, Thomas felt something shifting in his chest. Not the crushing weight of guilt he'd carried for 3 years, but something lighter, something that might eventually grow into hope. Maybe Catherine was right. Maybe it was time to stop punishing himself and start living the life James had died to save. The church bell's angry clanging shattered the peaceful morning quiet, its frantic rhythm telling everyone in Dusty Creek that something terrible was happening. Thomas jolted awake on the Fletcher family's couch where he'd spent the night watching over Pete, his hand automatically reaching for the gun that wasn't there. Across the room, Catherine stirred from her chair beside Pete's bed, her hair disheveled and her dress wrinkled from sleeping upright. "Fire!" someone shouted from the street outside. "Fire at the Patterson place." Thomas was on his feet and running before his mind fully caught up with his body. The Patterson house sat on the hill overlooking town, and from the Fletcher's front porch, he could see thick black smoke billowing into the dawn sky like a dark prayer. Orange flames licked at the roof, and even from this distance, he could hear the terrifying crackle of wood being devoured by hungry fire. "Mrs. Patterson," Catherine gasped, appearing beside him with her shoes in her hand. She's all alone up there. Thomas was already moving toward his horse, his mind switching into the soldier's calm that had kept him alive during countless battles. Fire was different from enemy bullets, but it was still something that could kill you if you weren't smart and fast and careful. "You stay here with Pete," Thomas called over his shoulder as he swung into the saddle. "I'll get her out." "Like hell I will," Catherine shot back, surprising him with language that would have made Mrs. Patterson blush. She grabbed the mane of Pete's old mare and pulled herself up bareback. Her torn dress hiked up around her knees in a way that was definitely not proper for a Boston lady. They rode hard up the hill, the horses' hooves drumming against the packed earth while smoke stung their eyes and throats. Other townspeople were running toward the fire from all directions, carrying buckets and blankets and the kind of desperate hope that people needed when everything was falling apart. The Patterson house was a furnace by the time they arrived. Flames poured from the kitchen windows and licked along the roof like bright tongues trying to taste the sky. The front door stood open, and through the smoke Thomas could see Mrs. Patterson stumbling around inside, coughing and calling for something. "My pictures!" she was crying. "I can't leave my pictures." Thomas didn't hesitate. He jumped from his horse and ran straight into the burning house, the heat hitting him like a physical wall. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his own hands, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. But somewhere in that hell, a scared old woman needed help, and helping people was what James would have done. "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas shouted, following the sound of her voice toward the back of the house. "Where are you?" He found her in what used to be the parlor, clutching a wooden box against her chest while flames ate at the wallpaper around her. Her gray hair had come loose from its pins, and her face was streaked with soot and tears. "I have to save them," she sobbed when she saw Thomas. "All my memories, my husband's pictures from the war. I can't let them burn. Leave them." Thomas grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward the door. "The house is coming down." "No." Mrs. Patterson fought against his grip with surprising strength. "You don't understand. These pictures are all I have left of him." Above them, something heavy crashed down, sending sparks and burning debris raining around them. Thomas realized with sick certainty that they weren't going to make it out the way he'd come in. The flames had spread too fast, cutting off their escape route. But then Catherine's voice cut through the roar of the fire, coming from somewhere behind the house. "Thomas, back here. There's a window." Thomas half-carried, half-dragged Mrs. Patterson toward the sound of Catherine's voice. The wooden box clutched between them like a shield. The back bedroom window had been broken out, and Catherine was standing outside with a blanket, ready to catch them when they jumped. "You first," Thomas shouted to Mrs. Patterson, boosting her up to the window. She went through in a tumble of skirts and soot, Catherine catching her and pulling her clear just as a burning beam crashed down where she'd been standing. Thomas followed, diving through the window as the roof collapsed behind him with a sound like thunder. He hit the ground hard, rolling to put out the sparks that had caught on his clothes, his lungs burning from smoke and his hands raw from the heat. "Is she hurt?" Thomas gasped, crawling over to where Catherine knelt beside Mrs. Patterson. The old woman was unconscious but breathing, her precious box of pictures still clutched against her chest. Catherine's hands moved expertly over Mrs. Patterson's body, checking for injuries with the same skill she'd shown during Pete's surgery. "Smoke inhalation. Some burns on her hands," Catherine reported. "But she'll live. We got her out in time." Thomas looked back at what had been Mrs. Patterson's house. Nothing remained but burning timbers and smoke. 30 years of memories reduced to ash and cinders. But somehow they'd saved the most important thing. They'd saved her life. "The pictures," Mrs. Patterson whispered, opening her eyes. "Did we save the pictures?" Thomas looked down at the wooden box, its surface charred but intact. "We saved them, Mrs. Patterson. We saved them all." As Doc Henderson arrived to tend to Mrs. Patterson's injuries, Thomas found himself looking at Catherine with new eyes. This woman who'd seemed so fragile and ladylike had just helped him rescue someone from a burning building, risking her own life without hesitation. She was covered in soot and her dress was torn, but she'd never looked more beautiful to him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping, for not giving up." Catherine smiled, reaching out to brush ash from his cheek. "That's what people do for each other, Thomas. They don't give up, even when things look impossible." Around them, the townspeople worked together to put out the last of the flames, but Thomas barely noticed. All he could see was Catherine's face, streaked with soot but glowing with the kind of inner light that came from doing the right thing even when it was dangerous. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand what James had seen in her all those years ago. Catherine's scream cut through the afternoon air like a knife, sending every bird within a mile exploding from the trees in a panic of wings and frightened calls. Thomas dropped the fence post he'd been setting and ran toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs with the kind of fear that came from knowing someone you cared about was in terrible danger. He found her 20 yards from the creek, frozen in place like a statue, her face white as fresh snow. Coiled between her and the water was the biggest rattlesnake Thomas had ever seen, thick as his arm and longer than a man was tall. The serpent's tail buzzed with deadly warning, its diamond-shaped head raised and ready to strike at the slightest movement. "Don't move," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned during cavalry charges. "Not even a little bit. Just stay exactly where you are." Catherine's eyes flicked toward him without moving her head. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the snake's angry rattling. "I can't. I'm so scared I can't even breathe." Thomas slowly reached for the pistol on his hip, but stopped when the snake's head turned toward the movement. From this distance, with Catherine so close to the serpent, a gunshot was too risky. If he missed, or if the bullet went through the snake's body, he could hit Catherine instead. "I'm going to get you out of this," Thomas said, his mind racing through possibilities. "But I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" "Yes," Catherine breathed, though her whole body was shaking with terror. The snake was getting more agitated, its rattle growing louder and more frantic. Thomas knew they only had seconds before it decided Catherine was enough of a threat to strike. Rattlesnake bites could kill a grown man in minutes, and Catherine was smaller and lighter than most men. Moving with the slow, careful grace of a hunter, Thomas picked up a long branch from the ground near his feet. The wood was solid and straight, about 6 feet long, perfect for what he had in mind if he could get close enough without spooking the serpent into attacking. "Catherine," Thomas said softly, taking a step closer to the deadly standoff. "In a few seconds, I'm going to make a noise behind the snake. When I do, I need you to jump backward as far as you can. Don't think about it. Don't hesitate. Just jump." The snake's head swiveled toward Thomas, its black eyes cold and alien, its forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air for signs of danger. Thomas could see the venom glands swollen behind its jaws, ready to pump poison into whatever it decided to bite. Thomas raised the branch like a club and brought it down hard on a rock, creating a sharp crack that echoed across the prairie. The snake's head snapped toward the sound, and in that instant Catherine threw herself backward, landing hard on the ground but safely out of striking range. The rattlesnake, confused and angry, turned its attention fully to Thomas. It coiled tighter, its rattle a blur of motion, preparing to launch itself at this new threat. Thomas raised the branch again, but he knew that at this distance the snake could strike faster than he could swing. Then Catherine's voice rang out, strong and clear. "Over here, you devil!" She was on her feet, waving her arms and shouting at the snake, deliberately drawing its attention away from Thomas. The serpent's head turned toward her, and Thomas seized the moment to bring his branch down hard on the creature's neck, pinning it to the ground just behind its venomous head. The snake thrashed wildly, its powerful body whipping back and forth as it tried to escape, but Thomas held on tight to his makeshift weapon. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the serpent's struggles grew weaker and finally stopped altogether. Thomas collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Catherine ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and holding him so tight he could barely breathe. "You saved my life," she sobbed against his shoulder. "That thing would have killed me if you hadn't. You saved mine too, Thomas replied, stroking her hair with hands that were still trembling. Drawing its attention like that. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. They held each other beside the dead snake, both of them shaking with relief and the sudden understanding of how close they'd come to tragedy. Around them, the Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and dangerous and alive with possibilities. Thomas, Catherine said finally, pulling back to look into his eyes. I need to tell you something. Something I should have said yesterday or the day before, or maybe 3 years ago. Thomas felt his heart start beating faster again, but this time it wasn't from fear. What is it? Catherine took his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away dirt and sweat from his cheekbones. I didn't come to Wyoming just to deliver James's watch or to thank you for being his friend. I came because I've been in love with you since the first letter James wrote about you. The words hit Thomas like lightning, illuminating everything in a burst of brilliant clarity. What? James wrote about you constantly? Catherine continued, her eyes bright with tears. About your courage, your kindness, the way you'd give your last piece of bread to a hungry soldier. He said you were the finest man he'd ever known, and reading those letters, Thomas, I fell in love with the man James described. Thomas stared at her, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. But you loved James. You married him. I did love James, Catherine said softly. I loved him with all my heart. But Thomas, the heart is bigger than we think it is. It can hold more than one love, more than one dream, more than one chance at happiness. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. James knew. In that last letter, he told me that if anything happened to him, I should find you not just to say thank you, but to see if what I felt from his words might grow into something real. Thomas felt the last walls around his heart crumbling like the walls of Mrs. Patterson's house in the fire. Catherine, I don't know if I deserve dash. Stop, she said, pressing her finger to his lips. Just stop talking about what you deserve and start thinking about what you want. What do you want, Thomas Hartwell? Thomas looked into her eyes, seeing hope and love and the promise of a future he'd never dared to imagine. I want you, he said simply. I want us. I want to try to be the man James thought I could be. Catherine smiled, and it was like the sun coming out after a long, dark winter. Then that's what we'll do. Together. As they walked back toward town, hand in hand, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years' peace. The guilt was still there and probably always would be, but it no longer felt like a crushing weight. Instead, it felt like a reminder to live well, to love deeply, and to honor James's memory by building something beautiful with the life he'd died to protect. Behind them, the rattlesnake lay still in the grass, and ahead of them, Dusty Creek waited with all its possibilities for new beginnings. The stranger's horse thundered into Dusty Creek like a harbinger of trouble, its rider dismounting before the animal had even stopped moving. Thomas looked up from where he and Catherine were planning their wedding with Mrs. Patterson in front of the rebuilt church, his soldier's instincts immediately alert to danger. The man was tall and lean, dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that said he had money and the kind of hard eyes that said he knew how to use violence to get what he wanted. I'm looking for a woman named Catherine Morrison Blackwood, the stranger announced, his voice carrying across the town square with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. I have business with her that can't wait. Catherine went rigid beside Thomas, her face draining of color so fast he thought she might faint. Her hand gripped his arm with desperate strength, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. That's Marcus Blackwood, she breathed. James's brother. Thomas, he can't find me here. He can't know where I am. Thomas felt cold dread settling in his stomach like a lead weight. Why? What does he want with you? Before Catherine could answer, Marcus Blackwood's sharp eyes found them across the square. A smile spread across his face, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile a wolf might wear when it cornered a rabbit. Well, Marcus called out, striding toward them with confident steps. My dear sister-in-law, you've led me on quite a chase across half the country. Mrs. Patterson stepped protectively in front of Catherine, her elderly frame somehow managing to look formidable despite the size difference. Sir, I don't know who you are, but this is a private conversation about a wedding. You have no business here. Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, but I do have business here. Very important business indeed. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and waved it in the air. You see, my brother James left behind some debts when he died. Quite substantial debts, actually. Thomas felt Catherine's grip on his arm tighten even more. What kind of debts? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Gambling debts, Marcus replied smoothly. James had a weakness for cards and horses, it seems. Before he married sweet Catherine here, he borrowed money from some very serious people in Boston. People who don't like to wait for their payments. Catherine's voice was shaky but determined. That's a lie. James never gambled. He was the most responsible man I ever knew. Marcus's smile grew wider and more unpleasant. Oh, my dear Catherine, there's so much about my brother you never knew. But don't worry, the debts transfer to family members when someone dies. Since James can't pay, and since you're his widow, the responsibility falls to you. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and Catherine. Every instinct he'd developed during years of cavalry service was screaming that this man was dangerous, that his smooth words and expensive clothes hid something ugly and violent. How much? Thomas asked bluntly. $5,000, Marcus said, his eyes glittering with satisfaction at the shocked gasps from the small crowd that had gathered. Due immediately, with interest. $5,000 was more money than most people in Dusty Creek would see in their entire lives. It was enough to buy a dozen ranches or a small hotel, or a future that now seemed to be crumbling around them like sand. I don't have that kind of money, Catherine whispered. I don't have any money at all. Everything I owned, I spent getting here. Then you'll have to come back to Boston with me, Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. There are men there who are very interested in discussing alternative payment arrangements with you. The way he said it made Thomas's blood run cold. He'd heard stories about what happened to women who couldn't pay their debts in cities like Boston, and none of those stories ended well. She's not going anywhere with you, Thomas said firmly. If there are really debts to be paid, we'll find another way. Marcus looked Thomas up and down with obvious contempt. And who might you be, cowboy? Some frontier nobody who thinks he can solve problems with his fists. I'm the man who's going to marry Catherine, Thomas replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. And I'm the man who's going to make sure you leave town the same way you came in alone. The tension in the square was thick enough to cut with a knife. People had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation, sensing that something important was happening but not understanding exactly what. Marcus pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time with exaggerated casualness. Well, this has been entertaining, but I have a schedule to keep. Catherine, you have until tomorrow morning to decide. Come with me willingly, or I'll have the territorial marshal come and arrest you for theft. Theft? Mrs. Patterson sputtered. What theft? The theft of $5,000 in debt that legally belongs to the estate, Marcus replied smoothly. Running away to avoid paying debts is a crime, and I have all the paperwork to prove it. He tucked the watch back into his coat and tipped his hat in mock politeness. I'll be staying at the hotel tonight. Pleasant dreams, Catherine. I do hope you make the right choice. As Marcus walked away, his spurs jingling against the wooden sidewalk, Thomas felt Catherine collapse against him like a building with its supports knocked out. He's lying, she sobbed into his chest. James never gambled, never borrowed money. He was saving every penny to buy us a little house after the war. Marcus is lying about everything. Thomas held her tight, his mind racing. But can he prove you're lying? Does he have papers that look real enough to fool a territorial marshal? Catherine's silence was answer enough. In a place like Wyoming Territory, far from Boston and James's real records, fake documents might be enough to destroy their future before it even began. Doc Henderson appeared at Thomas's shoulder, his face grim with understanding. Thomas, that man's not just after money. The way he looked at Catherine. He's got other plans for her. Thomas nodded, his jaw clenching with determination. Then we better make sure those plans don't work out. But even as he said it, Thomas could feel the walls closing in around them. Tomorrow morning seemed both too far away and not nearly far enough to figure out how to fight an enemy who had law and money on his side. Dawn broke over Dusty Creek like a curtain rising on the final act of a play, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Thomas hadn't been so focused on the life-or-death drama about to unfold. He stood at the window of his hotel room, watching Marcus Blackwood's expensive horse being saddled in front of the stable, knowing that in less than an hour Catherine would have to make a choice that could destroy both their futures. "Are you sure about this plan?" Doc Henderson asked from behind him, his voice tight with worry. "If this goes wrong, Catherine could end up in prison, or worse." Thomas turned away from the window, his face set with the kind of grim determination that had carried him through cavalry charges and desperate battles. "It's not going wrong. It can't." Across town, Catherine sat in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, surrounded by the women of Dusty Creek who had rallied around her like a protective wall. Martha Fletcher, still grateful for Catherine's life-saving surgery on her husband, held Catherine's trembling hands while Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, read through the legal documents Marcus had left as proof of his claims. "These papers look official," Sarah admitted reluctantly, "but something about them doesn't feel right. The dates are wrong, for one thing. They say James borrowed this money after he was already dead." Mrs. Patterson snorted with disgust. "That Marcus Blackwood is a snake in expensive clothes. I knew his type the moment I laid eyes on him. But knowing he's lying and proving he's lying are two different things." Catherine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had become her home, the place where she'd found love and purpose and a future worth fighting for. In a few minutes, she would have to walk across that square and face Marcus Blackwood, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether she spent the rest of her life free or trapped. "There's something I need to tell you all," Catherine said quietly. "Something I should have said yesterday, but I was too scared." She turned back to face the women, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her voice steady with resolve. "Marcus isn't really James's brother. He's James's cousin, and he's been trying to get his hands on what little money James left behind since the day of the funeral." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open, and Martha Fletcher gasped audibly. In Boston, Marcus told everyone that as James's closest male relative, he should inherit everything, Catherine continued. "But James left a will giving everything to me. Marcus has been trying to break that will for 3 years, and when he couldn't do it legally, he decided to try other methods. Like chasing you across the country with fake debt papers," Sarah said, her teacher's mind quickly grasping the implications. Catherine nodded. "He's betting that out here, far from Boston and anyone who knew James. His word will be good enough to force me to go back with him. Once he gets me back east, where he has friends and influence." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what would happen to a woman alone and friendless in a big city, at the mercy of a man with money and connections. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Thomas stepped inside, his face calm but his eyes burning with the intensity that came before battle. "It's time," he said simply. "Marcus is waiting in the square." Catherine took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, calling on the same inner strength that had carried her through James's death and her journey west. "Then let's not keep him waiting." The women of Dusty Creek formed a protective escort around Catherine as they walked toward the town square, their faces set with the kind of fierce determination that frontier life bred into its survivors. Behind them came the men Pete Fletcher, moving slowly but determinedly despite his recent head injury, Doc Henderson with his medical bag, and half a dozen ranchers and shopkeepers who had decided that Dusty Creek took care of its own. Marcus Blackwood stood beside his horse, checking his pocket watch with theatrical impatience. When he saw the approaching crowd, his confident smile flickered slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Catherine, my dear," he called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I trust you've made the sensible decision?" "I have," Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I've decided that you're a liar and a fraud, and that I'm not going anywhere with you." Marcus's face darkened with anger. "That's a very foolish choice. I have legal documents proving dash." You have forged papers and a pack of lies, Thomas interrupted, stepping forward with something in his hand. But we have something better. He held up a telegram, its yellow paper bright in the morning sunlight. This arrived on the morning stage. It's from the Boston Police Department, in response to a wire I sent yesterday asking about one Marcus Blackwood. Marcus's face went pale, but he tried to bluster through. I don't know what you think you've proved, Dash. It says that Marcus Blackwood is wanted for questioning in connection with several cases of fraud and forgery. Thomas continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. It also says that the real James Blackwood left no debts and no living brothers. Only a cousin named Marcus who has been trying to contest his will illegally. The crowd murmured with satisfaction, and Marcus's hand moved toward his coat in a gesture that Thomas recognized immediately. But before Marcus could draw whatever weapon he carried, Pete Fletcher's voice rang out from the crowd. I wouldn't if I were you. See, we've got ourselves a little welcoming committee here. Marcus looked around and realized for the first time that every man in the crowd was armed, and every gun was pointed in his direction. His shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him, defeated by the simple truth and the united determination of people who protected their own. Mount up and ride out, Thomas said quietly. Don't come back, ever. Marcus climbed onto his horse with as much dignity as he could manage, his expensive clothes now looking shabby and ridiculous in the harsh morning light. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Catherine replied firmly. It's been over for 3 years. You just finally figured it out. As Marcus rode out of Dusty Creek, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying since James's death. She was free from the past, free from fear, free to build the future she dreamed of. Thomas took her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt like a promise. So, he said with a smile that lit up his whole face, where were we with those wedding plans? Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together with delight. We were just getting to the part about the flowers and the dress and the cake. Oh, this is going to be the most beautiful wedding Dusty Creek has ever seen. As the crowd dispersed, chattering excitedly about the morning's drama and the upcoming celebration, Thomas and Catherine stood together in the town square where their story had really begun. The Wyoming sun climbed higher in the endless blue sky, and somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks sang their liquid songs of hope and new beginnings. James would be proud, Catherine said softly, looking up into Thomas's eyes. Yes, Thomas replied, finally at peace with his past and ready to embrace his future. I think he would be. Hand in hand, they walked toward tomorrow, leaving the ghosts of yesterday behind them in the dust of a frontier town that had taught them both the true meaning of home